If it's your first time gardening or your first year gardening, then you're a beginner gardener. What you might not know is that I'm also a beginner gardener, and I'm here to share all my lessons to help you in your journey as a beginner gardener. Don't let this beautiful designer garden fool you. We actually moved into this property in October 2021, and the garden had already been set up. My goal is to turn this designer garden into an edible designer garden and share each of the lessons that I've learned with you. So please subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss the transformation of the One Dutch garden into an edible designer garden. Back to the tips. The changes I've made in the garden are not so noticeable when you take into account the entire structure of the garden. And that's my first tip. Start small. It doesn't matter if you have a large piece of land that you're working with or if you're working with a tiny balcony. It's always important to only do what you can manage. So start small with an area that you can easily manage over the weekend or after work during the weekdays. Plants need a lot of observation and care, and the smallest form of neglect can actually cause quite a lot of setback in your garden journey. On my property, I cleared out 4 different spaces, and the 4 spaces are one of the spaces at the back, right close to the shed, another space right running along here, which I've turned part of it into an edible hedge by planting some berries, and a middle garden that is mostly flowers and vegetables. And in the front yard, I've only taken up one of the beds that I have available. These areas are close enough for me to walk and check on all the plants within a 15-minute walk in the morning, which makes sure that I don't neglect any of the plants that I do put into the soil. Which brings me to my second tip. You need to prepare your soil. Soil is a living matter, and the plants that you are going to put in actually feed from that soil. So depending on the space that you have available to you, you might need to first remove all the plants or cover the ground in order to kill off the plants that are already growing on there. And then you need to layer it with compost, allocate some garden paths, and make sure that you put in some mulching, whether you use wood chips or you use grass as a living mulch. That also helps along with your pots. I have a frog that lives in the pond, so please, whatever noises that you might be hearing, you know what it is. Where was I? With regards to the soil, on my end, in order to prepare the 4 beds that I had chosen, I removed the ornamental grasses that were in the soil, and then I bought 2 metric tons of compost. I layered it all over those beds, and then I put wood chips as a mulch. I chose wood chips because they do protect the soil from the evaporation that might happen during the day, during the summer days. So it keeps the soil moist. It also decomposes over time, so it feeds the soil, and it is actually a good place for some of the creatures to hide in and live there. But that could be a disadvantage for you, and I will discuss that on another video. Another important thing that the wood chips actually do is keep away the slugs. My third tip is to know the sun's path on your property. I mean that you should know exactly how your property will receive sunlight during the summer and during the winter. In my property, we have the front of the house facing towards the north, and then the back of the yard is exposed to the southern sun. Knowing the sun's path is actually quite important because this determines where you will place each of the plants that you are going to plant into your garden. The big difference in how much sunlight each part of my garden gets makes a huge difference in the plants that I'm planting. For example, right now it means that the broccoli that I had planted in a sunny spot that was just enough during the spring no longer likes the place that it's in, because now it's getting way too much sun, and it's a cool season crop which would much rather do better underneath some dabbled shade like a tree's shade or something else. And it also means that the berries that I planted during the early days of spring in a spot where the garden was getting the most sun no longer get as much sun as they need during summer. I should have rather planted them in a spot that gets as much sun during the summer as possible, so that I ensure that the berries can produce quite well during that time. This brings me to my next tip. It's important to understand the sun requirements of each of the plants that you're going to be planting. Granted that sometimes this can only be experienced. You will only truly find out how plants react once you have tried them out yourself in your particular garden. But there is tons of material online, from blogs to magazines and even this channel and other channels on the internet, that give you tips regarding the sun requirements of particular plants that you might want to grow. I think of it in this way. There's two types of crops: cool season crops and summer crops that absolutely love the sun. The cool season crops can be grown during summer, but would rather prefer to be grown under dabbled shade of a tree where it's not getting as much sunlight during the summer. And there's sun-loving crops such as watermelon that want to be in the sun and get as much of the light as possible, because they are crops that require as much light as possible in order to form the fruit or the bulbs that they are growing. Another example is beetroot. If you plant your beetroot in the shade during the summer, it won't produce the bulbs that are big and juicy as you might expect to find when you grow it in the sun. This brings me to my fifth tip: choosing whether you are going to buy seeds or if you're going to actually buy plants that have been grown and germinated inside a nursery or a plant shop. There's both advantages and disadvantages of either one of them. I'll start off by talking about the seeds. The advantages is that seeds are very cheap. You get tons of seeds in the packet, and you will always have a huge variety that you can try. You can also save your own seeds if you like. But the cons are that it's very time intensive, so you are investing your time to germinate and grow these plants. You have to buy or make your own compost. You have to have containers where you are going to grow these, or make the soil blocks in order to grow the seeds. Whichever method that you choose, it also doesn't guarantee that all the seeds will actually lead to fully fledged plants. So there's always a risk over there. But it is what you might decide to do, because then you know that you have more than enough seeds to try out, and you did not spend as much money in preparing your garden in that manner. If we are talking about plants that you buy from the nursery or from the garden shop, they can be quite expensive. That's one of the cons. But let's start with the advantages. You already get a plant that is fully formed. You can just take it home, make sure that it's hardened off, and then put it in the soil, and all you have to do from there is taking care of the plant. So there's no time investment in growing the plant, and you don't need to buy the initial seed compost that you might need to grow the seed. But there's also disadvantages. Plants that are grown in a nursery have actually not been accustomed to the natural weather outside. So when you get home with the plants, you have to get them used to the harsh conditions that they will be facing, not protected by the nursery environment that is quite moderated at all times. Which means if you get this wrong, your plants might fail. They are more expensive because you are buying plants that are already grown. They've already spent the time and the money in order to grow that seed into a fully fledged plant. So you have to think about if you are willing to buy as many plants from the nursery as you might buy. Another thing that a lot of people have complained about is that plants from the nursery, some tend to be root bound. which means that the plant has grown for too long inside the container that it was started in. So when you get home, you actually have to do a lot more work in order to free the roots and make sure that the plant gets enough nutrients from the soil that you are putting it in. On my property, I chose to go with seeds. I thought this is a cheaper method and I have quite a large space to plant, so I don't want to spend that much. But what I didn't know is that a lot of the seeds did actually not germinate, such as a lettuce called Fourth Wonder of the World. That did not germinate when I put it directly in the soil or even in the modules that I was growing it in. In summary, the most important things as a beginner gardener to take into account: start small, prepare your soil, know the direction of the sun on your property, know the sun requirements of the plants that you will be growing, and last but not least, make sure that you choose well when you're choosing between seeds or buying plants that are fully fledged from the nursery. I hope these tips can help you avoid some of the beginner gardening mistakes that I made and that you will succeed in your gardening journey as a beginner gardener. See you on the next video with my froggy. Bye!